So for those of you who are unaware, PSA and eBay both have what's called vault services. So what a vault service is, and I'll go on the eBay page to start. So what this is eBay or PSA will take your graded cards and store it in an off-site facility to be protected, to be safeguarded, to be whatever. For eBay specifically, if we're just going to focus on this, because I need to kind of talk about it a little bit more in depth. So eBay, if you are a seller, you can sell directly out of the eBay vault. So you can kind of see here, and this has changed a little bit and will change from what I'm about to talk about. But basically the premise is you let eBay keep your high value cards. And I think it was $250 or higher are what's eligible. So when you sell a card out of the vault, you have no seller fees and the storage fees. So there's 0 storage fees and 0 selling fees. I know the last time I checked this, if you are a buyer trying to buy cards that are in the vault, it's now upgraded, or it's now upped to 3%. So it's just a way that instead of having your cards shipped to you or whatever, or selling it out of your house, you can sell it out of eBay specifically. And it's the same thing for PSA. So PSA, for those of you who did not know, purchased not too long ago the auction house called Golden. So they have a very similar service to where it's just a standard auction, but this auction house is actually linked with PSA, meaning that when you have your cards in the PSA vault, you can sell out of the Golden auction house. So what does this really mean, right? So we just looked at this quick overview. So this is now what it kind of looks like. So Golden, PSA sold Golden to eBay, essentially doubled their inventory or their exposure. Both the PSA vault and the eBay vault are now combining so that it all is streamlined. So what does that mean from a collector's point of view? So here is a quick flow diagram here on what this actually means. So here I am, step 1 as a collector, right? So here are my cards. I have them ready to get graded. So step 1, collector sends the cards over to PSA. So PSA says, yep, we grade your cards. You now have the option to either have the cards be sent back to the collector, which is kind of standard in the sense, or you can now have them go, or you can go and put them into the PSA/eBay vault. Card gets graded at PSA. You say, yes, I want to store this in PSA eBay vault. And based off of what I've seen so far, and again, a lot of these prices are probably going to change, but currently there's no charge to store these in the vault. Again, it might change with the acquisition or the partnership, but just kind of hear me out here. So now the idea is if you have your card sitting in this PSA eBay vault, you can directly list the card on eBay without having to then manually go through and do the listing yourself. You can essentially just launch eBay as a seller, say, what cards do you want to sell? You say, I want to sell the cards that are currently in my PSA eBay vault. It auto makes a listing, and then you're ready to go. So what happens is that the buyer, which I'm going to talk about in a second, the buyer has to pay currently, as of 2024, a 3% buyer's fee. So if a buyer wants to buy cards that are listed and stored in the vault, they have to pay a 3% premium of the total value of the card to even purchase this. So let's say this is a $100 card. They have to pay 3% on top of that. So it would be $103 that that person would have to pay to get access to that card. So they buy it. So buyer's happy with the card. eBay sends the collector the money. So you can kind of see this very streamlined approach that almost goes into like a one-way circular motion for a collector. So the only action currently that a collector honestly has to like put in any of the work is to submit the card, right? Because PSA handles the grading. You give the option to PSA to store it. You give eBay the option to automatically create a listing based off of what's in your vault. And then the buyer will buy the cards and then they send the money to you if the transaction goes forward. So it's super, super streamlined from a collector's point of view. So as I was kind of looking at some of this data, right, it also kind of bears the question, right? Like, why would PSA want to make a move like this, right? So eBay has really driven home the fact that they want to be the number one marketplace for trading cards, right? So kind of going back to eBay is really investing in TCGs or collectibles, right? eBay, as of last year, purchased TCG Player, and they're kind of still in the works of actually doing something with that. eBay is really investing a lot of their time and effort and resources into positioning themselves as the number one marketplace for trading cards. And so PSA, using Golden after they acquired Golden, right? They are very focused on obviously collectibles. That's their main drive, but optimizing the method of selling cards much more in the last few years, especially during COVID. So they're trying to streamline the grading to market to sales for the customer as much as possible. And you can see that when they purchase Golden. You can see that with these partnerships. You can see this coming to a head a little bit. So for PSA, that's why it made so much sense to work with eBay, because, not a lot of people really knew about Golden. To be honest, when I was doing this research for the last week, I didn't really know, I knew PSA purchased Golden, but I never really went to Golden. I never really looked at their listings or anything like that. So it didn't really make too much sense. But them selling Golden to eBay and then partnering with eBay to essentially do the same thing, which is when a card's graded and a card's vaulted, immediately and easily sell it on eBay, was such a good move for PSA and eBay specifically. So this kind of starts to go to a very interesting talking point with like how we are starting to view cards as a whole, right? So the biggest thing that I thought of when I first heard about this is that it almost seems like people are starting to treat cards, like Pokemon specifically, more so as investments and less of collectibles on average, just based off of what I've seen. You guys can probably even see with like TikTok and algorithms and stuff like that. There's so many people that talk about PSA 10s costing X amount of dollars, what to invest, what to buy, what to sell, all of those things. If you were to compare that to stocks and bonds and whatever, those conversations start to blend together, right? So what's happening is people are starting to position themselves into seeing collectibles as a long-term asset, right? Or an alternate asset. So with that being said, what's starting to happen is we're almost starting to see these really high-end cards almost start to kind of take a back seat and essentially never see the light of day to a degree. Because one of the biggest pain points that I see this service really solving is it's so difficult to sell really high-end cards. So for example, this Pokemon EX Dragon Frontiers Gold Star Charizard PSA 10, right? Currently listed at $40,000, right? So with a card of this magnitude, right, being in someone's possession, trying to sell it and do whatever, for a card of this price and this value, it makes much more sense from a security protection standpoint to have a company whose sole purpose is to protect these types of cards, to hold it on your behalf, especially if the storage fee and selling fees are next to zero. So it makes way more sense from a purchase or from a storage perspective and a selling perspective, especially of this price. It makes way more sense to store it at that facility versus having it at your house. If you had God forbid, you had a house fire or a flood or anything like that, this $40,000 card, if impacted or affected, immediately goes to zero in a blink of an eye. And from an investment perspective, imagine having, it's like there's no different than like Bitcoin or crypto or whatever, right? If it's super high, 40,000, and then all of a sudden it tanks to zero, there's nothing you can really do. There's not much you can do. So I see that this service is really good for cards like this specifically. So that's one of the things that I like about it. The no selling fees and a more streamlined entry into the vault. Another one that I really like is a lot of people, especially when new sets come out, they want to flood the market, right? Be first to market. So when a new set comes out, especially for Charizard, there are so many people who try to submit those cards to PSA, get the first 10 ever in the world, and sell it as soon as possible. This whole streamlined process that we were talking about with this flow, if this card is the first ever PSA 10 Charizard, you go immediately to PSA, you say, yes, I want to vault it, without having to wait for it to come back to you. You can immediately list it and have that fast turnaround and be first to market through this optimized flow. So for those of you, or for those collectors who are really interested in being first to market, this is your solution for that. This will get you there almost immediately. And again, that will reduce I was just talking about reducing the time to handle and list products. The other thing that I was really interested in, time and time again, when I've seen videos, there's a lot of people who talk about, some people were like, oh, this would get a PSA 8 or a PSA 9. I'm going to negotiate as though it's such. TCG Player, right, only has one ranking, which is near mint. So if TCG Player is owned by eBay, is there ever an opportunity for a TCG Player to get involved to say, hey, if you want to kind of unlock this like special tier, right? Like if kind of going back to what eBay is asking for with the buyer premium, with the buyer premium fee, which is now 3%. If someone says, hey, I want to pay a premium to access near mint plus cards, again, this is probably not feasible because not a lot of people really know how to grade. They're not professional graders unless certain businesses go through like a grading certification. I don't know, but just hear me out. So let's say that a buyer says, I want to buy this card if it's a near mint plus category. TCG Player or eBay could say, hey, instead of having this shipped to you, you can just have it automatically get submitted to PSA to get graded at a discounted price or whatever, to further almost like a churn and burn kind of, like you just buy these cards at raw. You're essentially like gambling because you're buying them online. But again, TCG Player would have to go through leaps and bounds to even make this work. But if there was like an extensive scanning process to where you need to have like we do for grade reviews, right? If there was an extensive grade review for cards and they have to have like some degree of like stamp of approval, that's the only thing that I could think of as like a potential change in TCG Player if collectors were interested in it. I think, like me personally, I think that is way too far-fetched. I don't think that ever happened, but it's just something to think about. And going back to some of the more extensive, or more expensive rather, cards that would benefit from this service. One of the things, again, going back to kind of, if I'm willing to spend, for this example, if I'm willing to spend $40,000, I don't mind if this card goes through a very extensive authentication process, which is why, as you guys probably have seen, maybe like about a year, I think it was like either a year and a half ago, where eBay introduced the authenticity guarantee, where if I bought this card today, it would get shipped out to a facility to eBay. They would authenticate the card and then say, yep, it's real. And then they would send it to me. So it just continues to add on to that idea of more in-depth authentication, better storage, and again, treating these more as stocks and investments than actual collectibles, which kind of leads me into some of the things that I don't really like about this. So as we start to see PSA and eBay position themselves into streamlining the process of, here I am as a seller or a collector submitting cards and then instantly putting them into the vault to sell, it almost leads us to start to think about why we collect in the first place. For as collectors, right, you want to have these things in your possession. You like to show them off. For example, in our Discord, right, when I see cards and see people's collections, whether they're submitting in grade review or submitting in the media section, as a collector, I thoroughly enjoy seeing what other people collect. I really do. But as you start to kind of introduce some of these services like the vault, you never really get to see these cards, right? These cards will now, that were extremely hard and almost non-existent in the public eye, more cards are going to also disappear from the public eye, whether it be for better or for worse. So that's something that collectors really have to have an idea about. right? Like, is this going so far down the hole of seeing these as stocks and investment opportunities and that we're losing sight on what it means to be a collector? Will that impact the long-term price of these cards? It's tough to tell. It's really hard to tell. And it also kind of leans more towards, with NFTs, right? We're kind of leaning back to converting collectibles in this sense, more so like NFTs. So here's an example. Collector goes through this process, stores it in the eBay vault or PSA vault. This card is never in the collector's physical ownership. They own it on paper, legally they own it, but it's not in their house or in their binder or whatever, right? So it will sit in the vault forever. Buyer buys said card for eBay. If buyer then decides to vault it as well, which this will allow, so the buyer, when eBay, they said you can either have it shipped back to your house or put back in the vault. If collector buyers and sellers always kind of keep this like circular pattern of cards living in the vault, these cards will never be in someone's physical ownership ever. So that closely resembles NFTs, like the NFT model, right? Where the ape on the phone, you can sell the ape, buy the apes, whatever, right? But you don't physically own them in the sense you don't have them in your physical possession. So that's kind of what these are kind of turning into to a degree. So even if you wanted these out, right? So if the buyer physically wanted these, you actually have to pay a withdrawal fee to get them from the vault to go back into your physical possession. So is that a route that people want to take? I have no idea. For me, because again, I am a vendor, right? I physically go to shows, I go to collecticons, I go to whatever. I can't sell cards using a QR code, right? Like I'm not going to set up a booth, have a QR code to my vault to say, hey, you can buy these cards, but they're in my vault. Sorry, you don't have them physically. And so as a vendor, I want to have these cards in my physical possession so I can go to shows, so I can have a nice display case, right? But if you're an online only seller, the vault works. But again, is it going to over time diminish the allure of why you want to buy cards in the first place, right? So I don't know, right? Turning these into NFTs / stocks essentially. And then going back to that, if you don't have these in your physical possession, right? Even though PSA and eBay talk a lot about where their vaults are physically located, the safeguards that are put in place to protect your cards, but at the end of the day, you don't have them, right? You don't actually possess them. Now, I don't want to sound like Great Depression-y in the sense of, we do the same thing with banks, right? You have your money in a bank. You don't actually have the money in your physical possession. So it's kind of the same thing, but it's still something to consider to where you're just giving more external entities your possessions. So if something happened to the vault, or in this case, right, if you had your cards in the eBay vault, they are now being transferred over automatically to the PSA vault to get merged. If whether you like that or not, you have the option to withdraw, but you have to pay a withdrawal fee. So regardless of if you like it or not, you have no power, no decision of that happening. So if you're okay, perfect, right? But if something happens, right, like if worst case scenario, like what Betty mentioned a little bit ago, right? Let's say PSA is, kind of doing a weird scam where they're just grading everything 10s to kind of feed into their own profits. If they tank or go bankrupt or they just shut their doors down, there's no FDIC equivalent for grading companies, right? So for those of you who are unaware, FDIC is a limit to where if a bank forecloses, you still get your money back, or you still get a percentage of your money back if the bank forecloses. There's nothing like that for a private company, like a grading company. Like, yeah, like they have like insurance, like if something happens to your cards or whatever in the unit, it's still something you have to consider. It's a level of risk, although small, you still have to consider. So the things that I like, the things that I don't like, again, so if I were to kind of summarize that, things that I like, the no selling fees with a more streamlined entry into the vault, I think is good. The better handling of high value cards that are greater than $250, I think, is really important because there's a lot of that is missing right now. A reduced time to handle and list products. So if you're really into first to market, if you got the Charizard of the new set, you can have that listed. If you're lucky enough to get it as a PSA 10, you can be the first to market almost immediately. Opportunities with TCG Player down the line. Who knows? There might be some new service that allows you to like buy cards near Mint Plus or something to get graded. Who knows? Turning cards into stocks with protection from physical risk. Going back to the vault and talking about, the protection that the vault provides and all that stuff. And then much more in-depth authentication process. Again, eBay already does this with the authenticity guarantee. But in addition to that, there's going to be more that can be included, which is really big. The things that I don't like, we're kind of starting to treat these more as like stocks and NFTs and investments and less of collectibles, which at the core of what makes a collector is having these things physically in your presence. So will that impact the long-term collectability of these cards if they never see the light of day? If they're only seen on your cell phone or on a monitor? I have no idea. As well as you don't actually own these cards, similar to a bank. With a bank, you put your money in. You don't actually have that money physically on hand. You have to go through like a withdrawal process and everything like that. But the nice thing about banks is if it forecloses or quote unquote goes bankrupt, you have FDIC protections to help you get some of that money back, where you don't have that same level of protection with a vault program like this. So do I think it's good for the hobby as a whole? Possibly. Yeah, I think it's too soon to tell. Really, the big one is PSA and eBay are still discussing their pricing model. So a lot of the prices that I am going to talk about when I open it up for kind of Q&A aren't really set in stone. So it's really hard to tell. I think that's going to be a big one. It's also going to be interesting to see if buyers are willing to pay a 3% premium to buy cards that are in the vault. I really have no idea. It's only kind of time will tell type of thing. But it will be interesting. If you're, especially for online sellers, it's a huge opportunity for online sellers, especially with the next to zero selling fees, which is a huge problem in the online selling space, which is why a lot of people have been tending to go towards vendor shows or going to like local marketplaces or anything like that to sell cards, to try to reduce that amount of selling fees, especially with, prices being so high because we're in the United States, at least I am. So it's a lot of things to kind of talk about. So yeah, so that is kind of my wrap up and my thoughts on the PSA eBay acquisition. So now I'm just going to kind of really catch up with chat. I saw